Hey everybody, my name is Jason, also known as Pirate JC, and welcome to another Babylon video. This is part 3 of our epic video series entitled A Tech Artist Journey, where we are taking a curvy, twisty adventure together, like a hike through the woods to be able to create this dancing morph targets demo. The purpose of this video series is not to take the most direct route to creating this demo, not the most efficient path, but to do the opposite, to explore some crazy new techniques, some new tools, some things we haven't thought of before, to learn something new. I want you to think of this like a hike. It's about the journey where the view is gorgeous all along the way. And yes, we are headed somewhere, but it's the journey that's brought us here together. And that's what we're embarking on. Thank you so much for tuning back into this series. I hope you've gotten something out of it so far, where we've covered creating a mesh in the very beginning with Blender, to adding shape keys, to adding multiple UV sets, to learning the Blender Python API to batch rename things. And we are going today to learn how to create animation. Now, I know what you're thinking. Sure, I know how to create animation. I can set some keyframes and let the computer interpolate in between. Not in this series. This series is about doing something new. So we are going to create animation, and we're going to capture that animation and use it on our bars. But we're not going to do it in the way you're thinking. Instead, we are going to do it using fluid simulations. Yes, you guessed that right. If you're following along, go ahead and open your Blender file right where we left off. We're going to learn Blender's fluid simulations to be able to capture animations to later then use them to drive the height of our bars over time. Are you ready for this epic journey? Like I said, this is not the most direct path, but that's the point. So let's dive right on in. If you have your bar mesh created, you can go ahead and hide that. We don't actually need that at this point. Don't delete it. We're going to need it later. But we're going to go ahead and start by creating basically fluid simulation and modify it and get it to be exactly what we want to capture animation. Oh, I'm so pumped for this. Okay, notice that my cursor here, it's a little pro tip in Blender. My cursor, the 3D cursor, is not at the origin. If I were to add in something, say a cube right now, it's going to pop to that 3D cursor, and that's actually kind of a pain. So I can fix that by hitting Shift S and then cursor to world origin. And now whenever I add a new object, it'll pop in right at the world origin, which is just much easier to deal with. Okay, so let's start by hitting Shift A, and we're gonna go add a cube, okay? Now our cube by default is one unit by 1 unit by 1 unit in scale. I actually want it to be 2 units in X and Y, and so I'm gonna change that here to be 2 by 2 by 1, okay? And we're going to rename this to be water. Okay, we'll just call it water temporarily for now. Now what let's do is let's move this down by 1 unit. So we're going to say -1 and just make sure that it is basically below 0. And that's something that we're going to need for later on. Okay. All right. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to grab this and hit Shift D to duplicate it and hit Enter to commit that duplication. Notice that we have a new thing here called Water1. We're going to change that name to Domain. And this is to set us up to know what is the affected area for a fluid simulation in Blender, because Blender calls them domains, okay? All right, so what we're going to do is let's set the scale of this to be 2.5 by 2.5 by 4, okay? And we can hit Shift Z to switch into wireframe mode so we can see this a little bit easier. And then we want it to be at 2 units, okay? So now basically we have this thing that was going to become water, and we're going to basically tell Blender simulate this inside of the box known as the domain. To show you a quick example of this, I'll move this down just for a minute. I'm going to select my water box here, and I'm going to go to this physics tab, okay, in Blender, and I'm going to hit fluid. Okay, now under fluid right here, you can see I'm going to set the box that is going to be water. I'm going to call that flow. By default, it comes up with smoke. I'm going to change that to be liquid. You can't quite see that. Let me get rid of my camera here. We'll change smoke to liquid, and then we want to leave it at geometry. Okay, that's something that we want to leave it at. And then for our domain, we'll go to hit fluid. We'll change it to domain, and from gas, we're going to change it to liquid. And now we're basically there. We're basically set up. So what we're going to do is, with the domain selected, we'll just show you how quick and easy it is to create a simulation and tell Blender, start simulating fluids for us. We'll set the end of our frame range to 100. And then under type, I'm going to change this to all. And then I'm simply going to hit bake all. Now, depending on your computer and your individual specs, this may take a short time versus a long time. It kind of depends. For me, it's going to go fairly quick here. And I have basically particles that will now represent fluid. And if I scrub through them, you'll notice that they kind of splash up in the corners. It's a little bit hard to see, but I get kind of a little bit of a fluid simulation. And we can see this a lot easier by adding in a mesh generation on top of our particles to tell Blender, in addition to the particles, I want you to generate a mesh. So now what we do is we hit free all, okay? You can't quite see that again, so let me just get my camera out of the way. That's free all right here. And this is the button. We're gonna hit this free all and bake all a lot over and over and over again as you experiment with the exact parameters you want for your fluid simulation. So I'll hit bake all. It'll take, again, just a second. And then what I'll do is when that's done, I can start to scrub through it and I have this cool little liquid simulation. Now, obviously at this point, it's not doing a whole lot. We want to have some more fun with it. And you're probably asking yourself, where's he going with this? How in the world are we going to capture animation from just a plopped box? Okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to take a sphere and we're going to drop it through this liquid and get a cool spire, an abyss-like spire to pop up, and we're going to capture its animation as it goes up and down with gravity. How cool is that? Are you pretty excited? I am definitely excited. So here's what we're going to do. Let's get ourselves back set up here. Again, I want this domain to actually be set at 2 units here to start. And then I'm going to hit Shift-A to go grab under Mesh a UV sphere. Okay. Now, I mentioned the UV sphere is going to animate through this liquid domain. Now, don't worry right now if you're still seeing something like this. I move it all the way over to frame 0 so I can see everything nice and easy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to frame 10, okay? And actually here, I'll tell you what, just to make this nice and easy on ourselves, let's go back to domain and let's go to free all, okay? I want to go back to free all here. And just that'll clean it up so it's nice and easy to see. That's basically all it's doing. Say, get rid of everything we just did. All the simulation data that we just did, excuse me. All right, so now I want to grab the sphere, and at frame 10, I want to give this a value of, let's start with 2. And I'm going to insert a keyframe, right click to insert a keyframe. Now let's move our timeline to frame 20. And I want to move that all the way down, okay? And I want to move that basically down to 3 units, okay? So at frame 20, I want this to be -3, and I'm going to insert a keyframe here. Okay, now at 2, so it's going to move fairly quickly over the course of 10 frames. It's going to drop through there fairly quickly. So let's go ahead and make sure the domain is selected. Go back to our domain fluid simulation tab here and hit bake all. Okay. All right. And at this point, it's going to take a little bit longer to bake because there's some more calculation happening. Don't worry, it shouldn't be too long. And now let's take a look at what happens. I get this plot. Oh, nothing happened. Gotcha. There's one more thing we have to do. We did not tell Blender we want the sphere to also influence. I was wrong. When I say gotcha, I totally missed that. My fault. So we're going to hit fluid. We're going to go to type and we're going to go to effector on this one. Okay. Now let's go back to domain. We'll go to free all. Let's see, domain. Back here, go down to free all, and then we'll hit bake all again. Now we'll actually get the sphere affecting that fluid simulation. You can already see that there is a difference here on the screen. Okay, so as the sphere drops through this, notice that we're going to get a cool little plop. Oh, that's looking so epic. How cool is that? Oh, I love it. Okay. But it's a little bit exaggerated and a little bit intense. And kind of what we really want is just kind of, again, that abyss looking kind of spire that comes up and then just kind of drops down. And this is where you're going to have to experiment, okay? You're going to just have to take the time yourself to figure out what are the right parameters for your individual piece, basically, for what you want, for what you think it should look like. I will tell you, I've done some playing with this ahead of time, and if you're following along with me, the thing that looks the best to me is with the sphere selected, we're going to go back to frame 10. By the way, I'm hitting these arrow keys here, which I'm not entirely sure that you can actually see now that I think about it. So what we have is we have these buttons that say go to the next or previous keyframe. And so I'm jumping between these here, and I'm now at frame 10. Instead of 2, what I want to do is I actually want to set that to 1.995. And yes, I know it is kind of crazy that that would make a difference. But in this case, when it comes to fluid simulations, small things can have a big change. The scale of the sphere, the speed at which it goes through, the distance it travels to go through, all of that can have a pretty big effect on the end result. So now with this, and again with the domain selected, I'm going to go back and hit free all and then bake all. And now we should get something that's a little bit nicer to look at, a little bit more like that abyss spire that I had been mentioning that pops out. So let's check this out. And there it is. That's kind of cool. It separates a little bit, but still pretty cool as it kind of comes down. So it's a little bit less aggressive than what we previously had. Okay, so we now have created animation. And I'm sure you're asking yourself, okay, but how in the world would we possibly capture that? We're going to look at this thing as a height map, and we want to generate images that represent a height map so we can know how far above zero it is at any given frame, at any given moment in the animation. And I know this doesn't make a ton of sense right now, and it will, but to start off, here's what we're going to do, okay? We're going to go ahead and look at this from the side. I'm going to hit Shift Z at this point to get back to solid mode. And there's a couple of things that we can do. I can turn off the sphere and I can turn off the water in at this point in the 3D viewer here. I'm going to right click with this object selected, with the domain selected. I can right click on it and hit smooth shade just to make it a little nicer to look at and help us out down the road. And I want to look at it directly from the side, okay? And I want to scrub through this animation and look at, yeah, that's kind of the highest point there, and there's kind of the lowest point. I want all of this to be below zero until that spire comes up. So with this object selected, I'm going to hit G, and then I'm going to hit Z, again, to constrain movement up and down. And I'm going to move it down just a little bit. And there, everything is basically below zero at this point. And now when I go and capture this, the spire goes up, that abyss spire, and then that's kind of it. We could probably bring it down a hair more, maybe something a bit like that. We don't need to exaggerate it too much because, again, we want to capture that animation, right? We really want that. In fact, I'm going to undo that. I'm going to go up just a little bit more. I'm being a little bit nitpicky here, but this is, I think, going to help us in the long run here. Okay. All right. So now we're in pretty good shape. We actually now need to add a camera to look down upon this area, this simulation, and we're going to use that to render. So let's hit Shift A, and we're going to go down to add a camera. Now the camera will come in with a default rotation. We're going to hit 0 on all of that. I don't want any of that rotation. And then with the camera selected, I'm going to hit GZ and I'm going to go up. Now, if you want to look through that camera, you can do that. Let's go ahead and scrub to where that spire is kind of the highest, maybe somewhere in there. You can look through the camera by clicking this toggle camera view, okay? And there I am looking now through the camera. And of course, this box that we're seeing on screen here, that represents the actual, the part of the camera that will be rendered. The actual image that will be rendered is that. Okay, so with the camera still selected, I'm going to hit GZ and I'm going to animate out, or excuse me, move out just a little bit, not animate. And I want this to be a box. Rather than capture a 16:9 image, I want to capture a square image. And I can do that with the output properties. This tab right here kind of looks like a printer. I'm going to set that to 500 for X and 500 for Y. And I do not want any of this to fall outside of this box. I want the rendered image to be inside of the outer silhouette of this fluid simulation. So again, with the camera selected, I'm going to hit GZ, and I'm going to kind of constrain it to about something like that. And then I'll just scrub and make sure that, sure enough, everything looks like it's totally contained in that box. Okay, so with the highest point, something around there, we're now going to go create a very specific material to apply to this to effectively generate a height map. But let's look at something about our scene real quick. All right, let's look at this from the side. Notice that the 0 in Z is this red line, okay? That's 0. And this line represents 1, and this line represents 2. 2 units. 1 unit, 2 units. So the top of this abyss spire, it pops up to about 2 units, okay? And that's something that we're going to need to keep into account as we go create the material. So with this object selected, let's go ahead and hit the shading tab in Blender. Now, if you've never created a material in Blender before, it's actually pretty easy, pretty straightforward. It doesn't look like much here because it effectively doesn't have a material applied to it. So we're going to hit New to apply a material. Now, it's going to always pop in with the principled BSDF shader by default. We're going to get rid of that. We only want the material output. And then we're going to go ahead and add a few nodes. We add nodes in the material editor here in the exact same way we do in the 3D viewer. We hit Shift A. And we can click on search. And in this case, we want to search for geometry. We're going to get the geometry node. And this gives us access to information about the geometry that this material is applied to. Okay, now we're going to be after the position, because effectively what we want to do here is we want to paint a gradient onto this based on its height. So at 0, we want it to be black. And as that abyss spire goes up, we want it to start to be shaded gray and maybe even get close to white, okay? And we want that to be grayscale because we're going to generate it and use it as a height map, okay? So we can do this by adding another node. Again, Shift A to add. We'll click to search. And we're going to type in separate, and we're going to look for XYZ, separate XYZ. We'll pass in position. And of course, in the Blender world, Z again is up and down. So we're going to be after Z. And if I apply this right now to the material output, you'll see that we get a gradient that's applied. But the problem with this, as we were highlighting earlier, is this is black at red here, and this is going to be fully white at 1 here, because that is saying that is where we want 100% white, basically. So we actually need to do a math operation to divide this to make it more grayscale so that it effectively stretches where that gradient goes, or grows the gradient, okay? So we can do that by hitting Shift A, and we're going to search for a math node. And with that math node, we're going to set the operation to be divide, and we'll pass Z in here. And then we want our value to be, let's start with 3. And then we're going to pass that right in. And you'll notice that now white is technically way up here. And as we mess with this, we can actually drag it. Now white is up at 16. And so we're stretching out that gradient with this divide operation. We could do 2 because we're getting pretty close to it. But I'm just going to give myself a little extra buffer in case I'm not at the exact highest frame. It really doesn't matter because we can change this and normalize it later. But we'll start with 3, okay? And now when I go click on this and look through it, you'll notice that I have a height map essentially generated. And let's go ahead and check this out a little bit further. Let's go back to layout real quick. And we'll set this to the material mode to show us the material or preview the material. And we'll look through it. And yeah, there we go. It's looking pretty cool. Let's render this and see what it looks like, okay? You can render in Blender by hitting F12. Okay, and F12, of course, make sure that you don't have any function keys set, anything like that, like I just did. It will actually render. But notice that we have a problem here. This doesn't look anything like, well, kind of looks like, but it's got this weird gray around it. And that is because of a stupidly annoying problem with Blender. Where they're trying to be helpful, and honestly, I find this incredibly confusing. Let's draw our attention over to this panel right here, this little outliner scene explorer. I think they call it the collection view. And notice that I have some things that are visible inside of the 3D viewer here. But notice these camera icons. If you don't see those camera icons, you can click on this weird little funnel and enable these different things, okay? You want the camera on, which is what is going to be displayed in renders, as well as the eyeball, which is what is going to be displayed in the 3D viewer. Why they separate those things, I don't really know. If you have a good reason as to why that's handy, I would love to know because I haven't found one yet. I'm sure there's a reason, but for me, it's a little bit annoying. So what we need to do is we need to match that up. I don't want the sphere to render. I don't want the water to render. I don't want the bars to render. And frankly, I don't want the camera to render either. And so now let's go ahead and hit F12 again. And there we have it. We have a rendered image that's a height map of the highest point of this particular frame of animation. And check this out. If you right click and drag around, you can see the RGB data. Of course, I'm dragging in black, so it's 0, 0, 0 with an alpha of 1. But as we get closer up here, you can notice it change. And as I go up to a higher point of that abyss spire, the number rises higher and higher, and the top of it's somewhere in this world. Isn't that cool that we have pixel data that represents a height map? And of course, you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, so that means that now that we know at any given frame, we technically know that somewhere in this image is the highest point, and we could potentially capture that. And you are absolutely right, but we're going to do that in our next video. We've, in this video, created animation using fluid simulation in Blender. How cool is that? And then we've set ourselves up to generate a height map in the render that we will use to capture that animation. And how we're going to do that, I'm going to save for a little bit of a surprise. Thank you so much for checking out this video and continuing along with me on this journey, this tech artist journey, this crazy, twisty adventure like a hike through the woods. I hope you're learning something from it. I hope it's breaking your brain just a little bit in a really fun and engaging way. Thanks again for checking this out. If you haven't already had a chance to do so, please consider subscribing to this channel so that you don't miss any of the future updates that we add. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.